another name. Does anyone know what the basilisk lizard is also called? Nobody knows? Nope. I'll give you a hint. It has something to do with John chapter 6. This lizard is sometimes called the Jesus lizard. And do you know why he's sometimes called the Jesus lizard? Right. He's called this because he has the ability to walk on water. Actually, it's more like running, but he can walk or run on water. It's an amazing ability. And if you're really interested in this, I don't have the video to show you. There's a picture of him doing it. But if you want to really see him do it in action, you can go on YouTube, you can search for this, and you can find the Jesus lizard running or walking on water. And so because Jesus walked on water, that's why this lizard is sometimes called the Jesus lizard. Now, can any of us walk on water? No. We as humans, we don't have the ability to walk on water. If I were to step into a pool, I would immediately start to sink. We can't do what this lizard does, and there's a scientific explanation for this ability to walk on water, but for Jesus, it was something very different because humans do not naturally have the ability to walk or run on water. Only Jesus could do that. Now, why is this important? Why is it important that Jesus walked on water? Other than the fact that it's an incredible ability. Maybe you'd like to have this ability to walk on water, but it has to do with more than that. Why it's important. When we compare the story of Jesus here, of him walking on water, to a verse in the book of Job, we see who Jesus really is. So that verse, Job 9, verse 8, in the Old Testament, written many years before Jesus came into the world, the verse says, God alone stretches out the heavens and treads or walks on the waves of the sea. So notice that word alone. God alone walks on the waves of the sea. Nobody can do this except for God. So when you put that verse together with the story of Jesus walking on water, you can come to the conclusion that Jesus could do this because he is God. God alone treads or walks on the waves of the sea. And so what we see in John chapter 6 is that Jesus is the water walker. And we have the promise that he's always with us. Could you read that with me? Jesus is the water walker, and he's always with us. One more time. Jesus is the water walker, and he's always with us. So the one who promises to be with us always is the one who alone stretches out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. He alone has power over nature. Now, every story has a setting. You may have learned this in school. The setting is when and where a story takes place. So we find the setting of this story in verses 16 and 17. Again, this is John chapter 6. I'm just going to read through these two verses, and then we'll see what happens. John 6:16, when evening came. So this would be sometime after 6 p.m. His disciples went down to the sea. And verse 1 tells us that the sea is the Sea of Galilee. It's also known as the Sea of Tiberias. It's actually a lake, not a sea, but ancient people called it a sea, probably because of its size. But it's actually a lake, a freshwater lake, and it's the lowest freshwater lake on earth. It's a large lake, 21 kilometers long and 13 kilometers wide. So I tried to envision how big that would be. So maybe it would be from here to maybe Fisherman's Cove, or maybe a little bit beyond that. So that's how wide it would be. And then going this way, it would be going the other side of the harbor and up a ways through Halifax. I didn't do the calculations, but it was a large lake. Freshwater lake, the lowest freshwater lake on earth. And it was also known, probably still is known, for its sudden storms, maybe because of its low elevation and the mountains around it. You'll see a picture of it in a moment. Actually, you could show the picture now of the Sea of Galilee today. So you see the mountains around it, and the lake or sea is very low in comparison to other lakes, the lowest. So continuing on, it says they got into a boat, the disciples got into a boat and started across the sea to Capernaum. So they get into a boat, probably a fishing boat, not a large boat, but large enough to hold probably 12 to 15 people. So all the disciples are in the boat, and we're told it was now dark. The Gospels of Matthew and Mark also tell this story. Luke doesn't, but Matthew and Mark do. So we have it in 3 Gospels, and they give us some extra details. They give us that part about Peter, which we'll look at in a moment, or actually at the end, which was in the song. But they give us some extra details in their accounts of Jesus walking on the water. And Matthew tells us that the disciples were in the boat during the 4th watch of the night. And that would be between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. I imagine it closer to 3 a.m., but I don't really know. But they start in the evening. I don't know if it was still light out when they started, but it takes a lot longer than they had thought to get to the other side of the sea. So it's dark. And one other detail we know is that Jesus had not yet come to them. So he's not in the boat. Jesus is not in the boat with the disciples. Now, where is he? Well, Mark tells us that Jesus stayed behind to dismiss the crowd. Remember, he had fed them. It was a large crowd, over 5,000 people, maybe 10,000 if you count the women and children. So he tells the crowd to leave. We see later on that they didn't really leave. They just followed Jesus to the other side. And they wondered how he got to the other side, but that's for another time. But he dismissed the crowd, and then he, after that, went up on a mountain to pray. So he was alone and praying on the mountain. I don't know if it was one of those mountains we can see there in the picture, or maybe on the other side, I don't know. But he was up on one of those mountains praying. And Mark also says that Jesus, while he was praying on the mountain, could see the disciples in the boat. So it's kind of an interesting thought that Jesus up there praying could look down and he could see those disciples in the boat. And he'll see later that they'll start to struggle to get across from where they are to the other side. Now, I'm going to need some volunteers. I know everyone's so excited to come up here and help me with this, so I know I'll get so many volunteers right away, I'm sure. But I'm looking first for the younger ones. I need 3 people to play the part of 3 disciples. We have the boat here, which is the chairs. Could I get 3 kids? Okay, Simon, thank you. Stella and Timothy. Okay, good. 3 right away. I didn't have to try and beg anyone to come up. All right, so this is your boat, these 3 chairs. So position yourself on that boat. You want to all face the same way, probably. I'll give you each an oar. You can row on that side. You can pick whichever side you want. All right, so I'm going to grab my Bible, make sure I tell this story correctly. I also need 2 more volunteers, just 2 more. Okay, Eric? And Christian? All right, good. So, I'll explain this in a moment. Who would like the cardboard box? All right, Christian? You guys can come back here. And Eric, come on over here. You get the spray bottle. That was the most fun job, probably. All right, so we've seen verses 16 and 17. So the disciples, they're in their boat. They're rowing. trying to get from where they were to the other side to Capernaum. All right, so let's row. You got to row together, the same speed. Right. So, verse 18, the sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. So, Christian, what you're going to do is use that cardboard box to make some wind. We want to really see their hair blowing, so it look realistic. How about do it the other side? Hold it the other way. All right, that's good enough. I think I saw. Yeah, I can see Simon's. I can see Simon's hair blowing in the wind. So the wind, you can keep doing that as long as you can. You might get tired, but then as the wind blows, then the waves start to form on the sea. And so, Eric, you are the waves, and they're getting splashed with the waves. Okay, you got to unscrew that a little bit. Okay, they're getting a little wet with the waves. The wind is blowing. They're struggling. You got to look like you're struggling. Maybe you're starting to roll around in circles in the boat, not getting anywhere. So the sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. And when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, we won't wait till you row 3 or 4 miles, but I don't know how long it would take to row 3 or 4 miles, but they're doing it a while. They're getting wet. The wind is blowing. The waves are crashing against the boat. Maybe they're getting discouraged, and I'm sure they're getting tired. And then, when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea. So imagine Jesus is over there by that door. What would you do if you saw someone walking on the water? You don't know who it is at this point. You just see someone walking on the water. What would you think? Is that just a normal thing that happens every day? See someone walking on the water toward you while you're in the boat? So maybe you could look, try and get a clear view of what that is. It's dark, remember, so it's maybe hard to see. There was a picture I was going to show. It's a painting. It's probably not completely accurate, but we could put that up there. I don't think Jesus was glowing, but probably most of that painting, besides the glowing part, probably is pretty accurate. It was probably a boat about that size. So let's once more, let's do the waves, let's do the wind. And they see Jesus, and what are we told? They were, what do you think the emotion was? How did they feel? Frightened. They were frightened. Can you act frightened? Very good. Okay, they think it's a spirit, a ghost. All right, you guys can take your seat now. Appreciate you helping with that. That will help us visualize a little bit better the story of the disciples struggling on the sea, rowing hard but getting nowhere, and Jesus probably seeing them doing that up from his vantage point on the mountain, comes down and meets them walking on the water. So I asked, what would you think if you were in that boat? You were one of those disciples during that, I think we could call it a storm. And you saw a man coming towards you on the water. Again, that's not a normal, everyday thing that happens. The disciples in verse 19 were frightened. And as I said, Matthew and Mark tell us that the disciples think that Jesus is a ghost. But Jesus says to the disciples, verse 20, "It is I, do not be afraid." And then Jesus joins them in the boat, and right away they arrive at the place they were trying to get to all night. So the disciples were frightened, verse 19, but they became glad in verse 21 when Jesus said, "It is I." Verse 20. So they go from being frightened to glad when Jesus says, "It is I, it's me." Now, the original Greek, and the New Testament was originally written in the Greek language. It's been translated into English. In the original language, the Greek translated as "it is I," can be translated a different way. Before I talk about that, I want to go, though, to Exodus chapter 3. Exodus 3. And verses 1 through 6. Now, this is when the nation of Israel were slaves in Egypt. In Exodus 3, verse 1 says, "Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed." So here Moses sees something that, doesn't happen every day. The disciples saw a man walking on water who turned out to be Jesus. Here Moses sees a bush burning, yet it just keeps on burning. It's never consumed. It's never burned up. Verse 4, when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, as Moses says, "I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned," God called to him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses." And he said, "Here I am." Then he said, "Do not come near, take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." And he said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. So Moses sees something unusual, just like the disciples did, and he was afraid, just like the disciples were afraid. Now, the part I really wanted to read is found in verses 13 and 14. Because, Moses is told by God to go and be the leader of the Israelites, to lead them out of Egypt. And Moses is afraid because he doesn't think he's able to do what God has asked him to do. And verse 13 says, "Then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them?" Because he thinks, well, I'm going to go and they're not going to believe me and they're not going to listen to me. But God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And he said, "Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you." God also said to Moses, "Say to this people of Israel, the Lord." And in the original Hebrew, that's the name of God, Yahweh. "The God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations." So God gives to Moses his name. God in the Old Testament isn't just known as God. It just doesn't have that generic name, which really isn't a name. It's more a title. Moses is given a name, and it's the name Yahweh, which God says means I am. I am who I am. And I said the original Greek in John chapter 6 could be translated differently than "it is I." It can also be translated I am. And so that's significant because this is the name of God. I am. Now, for every other person, if we were translating the New Testament, for every other person, we would translate it as "it is I," or "it's me." That'd be the correct translation. But for Jesus, it's different. Not everyone walks on water, only him. And so it's a fitting translation when Jesus speaks these words. And if you read the Gospel of John very carefully, if you read it more than once, if you read it 2-3 times, you begin to see what John is saying about Jesus. You'll discover that John is presenting Jesus as the I am, as God the Son. There are 7 I am statements in the Gospel of John. The first one is John 6:35, "I am the bread of life." And there are many times when Jesus says, "I am." For example, maybe this is the clearest, in John 8:58, Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. He said he existed before Abraham, who lived hundreds and hundreds of years before the time when he spoke these words, even before the time of Moses. And so he's saying, I am. I am. He is God. So when Jesus said to the disciples, it is I, he was saying, God is with you. Let's see, there's an error there. It is I is what he should have said, or should be written there. Not I am he, but it is I. He was saying, God is with you. He was saying, I am God. I am the one walking on the water. Not only is he acting like God, walking on the water, he's also speaking like God, because he is God, the second person of the Trinity. God alone treads on the water, walks on the water, and he is walking on the water. So what does that mean for us today? That Jesus is the water walker. He is God. In many other parts of Scripture, not only is he with the disciples, but he promises to be with us, his people, his followers. And so what does it mean for God to be with us? You know, this is something I often think about, because I think we can really simplify this and think, well, God's with me, so everything is going to be fine. Everything's going to be as I plan, or everything's going to be, good. But when we look at Scripture, that's not what we see. So for God to be with us, it doesn't mean that my life will always be easy. Before his ascension, when Jesus went back to heaven after his death and resurrection, Jesus promised these same disciples that he would be with them always. And yet we know that they experienced a lot of suffering as they spread the news about Jesus throughout the world. And so he was always with them, but they suffered. A lot of bad things happened. Some of them were even killed because of what they had to say about Jesus. And so God being with us doesn't mean that my life will always be easy. It means that God will give me the strength, the courage, the peace when life isn't easy, when it gets difficult. So life won't always be easy for us. God being with us doesn't mean that everything will always be good. But it does mean that if we look to him, if we call out to him, he will give us the strength. He'll give us the courage. He'll give us the peace when life is difficult. And then we also see something in verse 21 at the end of the story. When the disciples got into the boat, or when Jesus got into the boat with his disciples, immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. And so God being with us also means that I will arrive at the land to which I am going. And by that land, I mean the land of heaven. Jesus won't abandon me. He won't abandon you if you are a follower of Christ, if you put your faith in him. He will make sure that we get to our desired destination. And so God being with us isn't a promise that life will always be easy, that everything will go as planned. It's not a promise that life will never get difficult, because we see over and over in Scripture that life was difficult at many times for the followers of Jesus. But it does mean that when life does get difficult, God will give to us the strength, the courage, the peace that we need in those difficult times. And then eventually, when this life is over, we will arrive in heaven. So Jesus is the water walker, and he is always with us. And think about those feet that walked on the water. Those feet that walked on the water. The feet that walked on the water are the same feet that were nailed to the cross. And so we have this man who is the God-man, Jesus Christ, with the ability to walk on water. He is the one who loves us. He is the one who died for us. He is the one who was nailed to that cross. The same feet that walked on water were nailed to a cross. He is with us, and he is for us. Now, we're going to end with this. We're going to go to Matthew chapter 14. And we're going to read that part about Peter, because this is probably the part that we all think of, or many of us think of who know this story. This is what we think of when we think about Jesus walking on the water. We think about what Peter did. So Matthew chapter 14, I'm just going to read some of those verses in Matthew's account. Matthew 14, 28 through, well, we'll go down to a few of the verses below. Verse 28 of Matthew 14. I'll go to Matthew, not Mark. Matthew 14. I was confused for a moment. Matthew 14, 28. And Peter answered him, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. He said, come. So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. And immediately reached out his hand. Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, O you of little faith, why did you doubt? And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, Truly, you are the Son of God. So when we looked at Jesus, he stayed on top of the water, but when he looked at the waves, he began to sink. I have here a container of water. I was going to do a little experiment to see whether a few objects sink or float. So I've not actually tested this myself, so it's a surprise to me as well. So the first thing I have is a metal spoon. Kind of looks like a boat. Will this sink or float? We'll see. It does sink. I don't know how well you can see that, but it did sink right to the bottom. How about this? I have a bar of soap. If you're interested, it's Dove. I don't know if that makes a difference. Will the bar of soap sink or float? I'll put it this way. Sink or float? Some say sink, some say float. It sunk. Maybe some bars will float, but this particular bar sunk. All right, we saw the metal spoon sank. What about this piece of metal, this piece of aluminum foil? Will it sink or float? It's floating. There might get water on top of it that will cause it eventually to sink, but if the water stays off of it, it will float. So we'll say it floats. All right, what about though if I take this and I crumple it? I don't know if it'll sink or float. Maybe it depends on how much I compact it together. Will it sink or float? It is floating. All right, I have one more thing. I thought it might sink, but it does float. At least this size of aluminum foil. I don't know if you have a huge piece, if it will sink or not. And finally, I have a piece of a wooden block, a Jenga block. Will it sink or float? This is the most mysterious one to me. I don't know. It is floating. So we had three things float. The two aluminum foils, the wooden block, and two things sink. The bar of soap and the metal spoon. So the question I want to end with is, are you a floater or a sinker? Now, I'm not talking about being in water, actual water. I'm thinking about the story of Peter. How at first he didn't really float, but he stayed above the water. But then eventually he began to sink. And that had to do with his faith in Jesus. When he looked at Jesus, when he trusted in Jesus, he stayed above the water. We could say he floated. And when he looked at the waves, when he felt the wind, when he forgot about Jesus, he began to sink in the water. And so when the wind and the waves come, when trouble comes into our lives, are you going to float or are you going to sink? Do you believe that Jesus is with you? Have you put your faith in Jesus? Have you trusted in him? Is he with you? If you are a child of God, Jesus promises to always be with us. He's the water walker, and he's always with us. And so when those difficult times come, will you be a floater or will you be a sinker? Will you remember that Jesus is with you? Will you call out to him to give you the peace, the strength, the courage that you need? When we find that promise in the Bible, God is with you, what we usually see is that people are afraid. And God says, I am with you. And so we need that same promise today because we still go through times when we're afraid, when we don't know what's going to happen, or when life is difficult. Jesus is with us. And so will we look to Jesus for strength, for courage, for peace, or will we just look at the problems and begin to sink? What I encourage you to do is to think about Jesus appearing to those, coming to those disciples in the darkness as they're alone in that storm. He comes to them walking on the water, and he is with them. It is I, he says. He is the I am. He is God who is with us. We need to look to him so that we stay above water and not sink and lose faith.